Have you ever woken up feeling amazing and then you checked your Whoop score or maybe your Oura ring score and that was actually pretty low? Well, as a scientist, that mismatch I sometimes got bothered me. So I decided to test a simple question. Do the scores from these wearables actually correlate with how you subjectively feel? Or in other words, are Oura rings or Whoop straps able to predict how you feel, and which of these two is actually better? And instead of testing this on myself, I asked 4 of my subscribers that own both an Oura ring and a Whoop strap to help out. They tracked quick subjective ratings for about a month and they shared their Oura and Whoop scores with me. And in this video we will focus on 2 things: the sleep score and the readiness or recovery score. And we'll look, based on a lot of data, how those relate to how those people felt in the morning, but also how they felt later in the day and in the evening. Now, for those of you that are new to the channel, my name is Rob and I'm a postdoctoral scientist specializing in biological data analysis. Now, one important note up front, this is not a medical study, it's also not a sponsored comparison. This is just a small real-world data set based on a lot of wearables, as you can see right here, for instance, meant to give you a nuanced, evidence-based hint about how these scores of Oura and Whoop behave and which one might be closer to your subjective feelings, but they're not a final verdict on either device. Also, a quick transparency note here, I have a discount affiliate link for both Oura and Whoop in the description below, but I genuinely use both the Oura ring and the Whoop strap myself, and I picked them for this video since they're sort of the market leaders in this area of health tracking. But let's get to the results and let's first see what I ask my subscribers to track every day. So they answered 3 questions in the morning and 2 in the evening. So in the morning I asked them, how sleepy or alert do you feel at the moment? The second question is, how would you rate the quality of your sleep? And third, how rested or refreshed do you feel? And in the evening, as I said, they had 2 questions. The first is, what was your average fatigue today? And the second was, what was your worst fatigue today? And then I compared those subjective answers to 2 scores of the Oura ring and 2 scores of the Whoop strap. So the Oura and Whoop sleep score, and then the Oura's readiness score and the Whoop recovery score. So the core idea here is pretty simple. When the wearable score is higher, do people also feel better in those days? Or do they feel less fatigued? Can we somehow match that objective score to a subjective feeling? Now, as I mentioned, each of those 4 people owned both a Whoop strap and an Oura ring, so we're using the same people for both devices. And they tracked for about a month, a little bit more, between 32 and 39 days. And most days had complete data, but sometimes maybe one value was missing. Overall, a pretty complete data set, I would say. As I mentioned, I'm a data scientist, so I love data. But let's start with the sleep scores because that's the most intuitive. And the first hypothesis or question I want to ask is, when the sleep score is higher than usual, do people also report better sleep in the morning? So that's plot 1 right here. So along the horizontal axis, we have their sleep score, and along the vertical axis, their subjective sleep quality as they scored it. It's normalized in some ways, and I'll get to that in a second. But both the Oura and Whoop show a positive correlation between their objective sleep score and the subjective data that people recorded. So that's here on the vertical axis. If we look at the correlation between the sleep score of both Oura and Whoop to the subjective score, Oura had a higher correlation at 0.46 for the Oura ring right here and 0.37 for the Whoop strap. So both devices clearly have a positive correlation. Oura does have a stronger correlation with this specific outcome in this specific data set. Now, I cannot say if Oura did really significantly better than the Whoop strap here as a trend towards that. And a correlation of 0.4 on average for both is not perfect, but it's definitely not random noise. It suggests that the sleep score often at least moves in the right direction when people feel their sleep was better or worse than usual. Now, of course, I don't think that these sleep scores can be perfect, and I actually don't want them to be perfect, since I don't think that people can always feel all the nuances in their sleep quality. So subjective sleep quality doesn't tell the full story, and objective measurements and then some kind of proprietary sleep score also don't tell the full story. It's the combination of an objective measurement with a subjective feeling that informs you on how to plan your day. Now, I do actually think that most of us can sort of feel the broad strokes of our sleep quality, but the reason we track in addition is to get additional data we cannot subjectively feel. And some of us will be able to feel more than others, so it's different between people. And we'll take a look at a lot more data in a second. And sometimes Whoop does better, sometimes Oura does better. It's super interesting. But before getting to that, let me actually explain how I did this analysis, because that's actually quite important. Now, one thing I wanted to take into account is that different people use different rating scales. One person might almost never choose very good, while another person might rate the same experience much more positively. If I were to throw all data together without correcting for baseline differences between people, correlations could be distorted. So the main analysis I'm going to show you is within-person centered and also divided by the standard deviation. In very simple words, that means that for each person, I subtract that person's average, so we all have the same average, and also make sure all points have a similar spread. So in a way, we're not asking, are the higher scoring people also the people who rate themselves high? Instead, we're asking, when this person feels better than usual, does their wearable score also go up? Now, this is much more interesting to me and much closer to how people would actually use it in daily life themselves. Track changes within themselves over time, and it's much less interesting to compare between two people. Now, also important here when I'm comparing both the Oura Ring and the Whoop strap to those subjective scores, I'm just using correlation because that's a simple, easy metric anyone can understand. I could use more fancy methods, but I think this is good enough for now. So let's move on to the next analysis. And these right here are the results for the question, how rested or refreshed do you feel? And the results are actually very similar to the first. So Oura sleep score correlated with feeling rested at about an R of 0.46 and Whoop sleep score correlated at 0.36. Again, both positive, and Oura has a clear edge here. Again, I don't know if it's significant, but it trends towards that. So if your main goal is that the sleep score should track as much as possible how you would personally rate your sleep quality and how rested you feel, these results suggest both devices have signal, but that Oura potentially has a better sleep score to match with that. But it's a very limited sample again. Next, I looked at morning alertness, and that's where things actually get a bit harder, it seems. So that's this plot right here. Alertness is not just sleep, it's also stress, your schedule, your training load, your mood, and probably a dozen other things. So we expect weaker correlations, and that's exactly what we see. Oura sleep score here correlated with morning alertness at about 0.24, while Whoop sleep score actually correlated better at 0.38. So Whoop has the higher correlation with alertness. Now, if you want to interpret this a bit carefully, I would say that neither device is a strong predictor, at least based on the sleep score for alertness, but the sleep score of Whoop does line up slightly better with the alertness in this data set. But let's now move on to readiness and recovery. Oura calls it readiness, Whoop calls it recovery, and they're basically both meant to answer a very similar question. How ready is your body today? And here we have those results, and we actually get quite good correlations, I would say. So Oura's readiness score correlated with feeling rested at about 0.41, and Whoop's recovery correlated at about 0.47. So similar, but Whoop is slightly higher here. The next thing I wanted to look at is the morning sleep quality, and there the two were basically tied. Oura readiness versus sleep quality had an R of about 0.39, and Whoop recovery versus sleep quality was about 0.38, so super close. So on sleep quality specifically, readiness and recovery are essentially the same for these two devices. Next, let's take a look at morning alertness and how it correlates with readiness and recovery. And here we see that Oura readiness correlated with alertness at about 0.31, while Whoop's recovery correlated at about 0.42. So again, Whoop is doing better here. So if your personal priority is, does my recovery score match how awake I feel in the morning, then based on this very limited data set, both are doing okay, but I would lean towards Whoop. But again, we're looking at such a limited data set here. There's only 4 people and some noisy data, so take these results with a grain of salt. Now, the part I personally find most interesting is the evening questions. Morning feelings are one thing, but many people, including myself, would want wearables to help answer questions like, will I crash today? How drained will I feel by the end of the day? And those are the kind of things that are hard to feel in the morning. And that's why I looked at evening fatigue in the questionnaire as both average fatigue and worst fatigue. So I have 2 fatigue measures. Now in the analysis, I actually inverted those fatigue ratings. So higher actually means less fatigued and lower means more fatigued, just because I want to keep positive correlations here. That makes it a bit easier to look at. Now, I did actually ask the participants to not check their scores in the Oura and Whoop app before the evening, but for some of them it wasn't possible. So some of them might have been influenced by knowing their scores beforehand, but they would know both the Oura and the Whoop score. So I would hope they would be equally influenced by both if it was the case, since we're also comparing Oura to Whoop here, but keep that in mind. And as you'll see in a second, when we compared readiness and recovery to evening fatigue, Oura readiness aligned more with end of the day fatigue than Whoop recovery did, at least in this data set. And I'll show you all the details in a second, but first, running this channel next to my full-time job is neither easy or cheap. I pay my editor Alex, I had to buy a bunch of different cameras right here for instance, and I also buy most of these smart devices myself. Now if you do decide to support, there's multiple ways of doing that. The most direct way is by becoming a YouTube member, which gives you early access to many of my videos. And I also have affiliate links also for the Whoop strap and the Oura ring in the description below. And this in most cases gives you the best discount possible and you'll be supporting the channel at the same time. Or another way of supporting is by using my general Amazon affiliate link before making any purchase on Amazon. If you make that your default way of accessing Amazon on your browser, it doesn't cost you any extra and it supports the channel anytime you make a purchase. You can even bookmark it, often with Command or Control D. And finally, I also have a discount link for Runna, my favorite running app, which has really helped me get the best personalized running plans. Or if you want to get Strava Premium, I also have a 20% discount affiliate link for that. Thanks so much for considering any of these. And thank you already if you subscribed or maybe consider subscribing. And let's get back to the results. And here we have the plot you were maybe waiting for. The correlation between readiness and recovery and the evening average fatigue that people reported. And as you can see, I might have said the wrong thing before. It's not Whoop, but Oura that correlates more strongly with the subjective feeling of average fatigue in the evening than Whoop. So Oura's readiness score and Whoop's recovery score. So we have values of 0.36 for Oura and 0.28 for Whoop. And we can actually also correlate them with the worst fatigue during the day. And here Oura even has a stronger correlation at 0.38 versus the 0.24 for Whoop. Now this doesn't mean that Oura can predict your day, and it doesn't mean you should make big decisions from a single score, but it suggests that within these 4 people, if the day ended up feeling more draining than usual, Oura readiness tended to be lower in a way that matched their feelings more consistently than Whoop recovery did. Now in addition to the readiness and recovery scores, I also took a look at the sleep scores and how these correlated with average and also worst fatigue. And in this case, both do very similarly. So Oura's sleep score has a correlation of 0.35 and Whoop 0.38 with the average fatigue. And for worst fatigue, both are better, where Oura correlates to 0.42 and Whoop correlates to 0.43. And interestingly here, these scores are at least as high or even higher than the readiness or recovery score. So right here we had the worst fatigue, where Oura had a correlation of 0.38 between the readiness and recovery score and the subjective feeling of worst fatigue, whereas this is actually higher for the sleep score. So sleep score correlated better than the readiness score and recovery score. And this somewhat unexpected finding that the sleep score correlates quite a bit better than the readiness and recovery score with average and worst fatigue might have also had to do with how I asked the question. Since fatigue can also be a consequence of people working out more that day, which they might have decided to do based on a good readiness score. Even though I asked them to not to look at it if possible, they might have just looked at it anyway. So if you have a suggestion for a good question next time, either to add a question or to replace one of my questions, let me know in the comments below. Now, before concluding, I also want to give you some context on how much the Oura and Whoop strap actually agree with each other directly, because this actually could help us to some degree try and understand how similar results we can expect from the different devices. And that is plotted right here for the sleep score. So this is the Oura sleep score plotted versus the Whoop sleep score. And here we actually see quite a good agreement, I would say. So this dotted line would indicate perfect agreement, so where the Oura and the Whoop sleep score are the same. And they're actually very similar, quite a bit more similar than the sleep scores I get between Oura and Whoop, where one of the two tends to be a lot higher. I think it's the Oura score, but I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's the Whoop score. But here they're actually quite similar with a correlation of 0.69, so very significant and also very close to that dotted line. So this actually surprised me. Now for the readiness and recovery score, we see sort of a systematic bias where the Whoop recovery tends to be lower than Oura's readiness, but again, the correlation is very strong at 0.63. So for the big differences, you mostly get actually very similar scores between Oura and Whoop, but only for the bigger differences, I would say. Even if you were to correct for that systematic bias here, you still often have maybe a 15-point difference between the two. So still quite different. And this is also expected because these are sort of proprietary scores. They've invented them almost out of thin air by combining several metrics. So it's really hard to judge which is better. That's why I wanted to make this video, so you also can get a bit of an understanding of how these two relate to each other. So what's in a way the most honest takeaway from all of this? Well, in this small real-world subscriber dataset, both Oura and Whoop score show meaningful but moderate alignment with subjective feelings. And I do think interpreting this for both Oura and Whoop is quite hard in the end. For instance, what would be the ideal level of agreement? I don't know. If they agreed perfectly, then there's no added benefit of actually taking the measurement. And I do not think we can actually feel everything about our sleep quality. However, we do expect some form of agreement. So maybe the one that agrees best with our subjective feelings is also able to capture most of the things we cannot feel. I find it hard to think about this. Maybe some kind of combined subjective score is the best test in a future video, since that metric probably comes closest to being useful. But what do you think? Could I have asked better questions? Could I have done better analysis? Let me know in the comments below. But before getting to the final conclusions, let's actually summarize the results. And I did that in this plot right here. So the colors right here indicate the difference in correlation between the Oura and the Whoop strap. We have the readiness and recovery score and the sleep scores. I calculate the correlation for the Oura ring and the Whoop strap, and I subtract Whoop's R from Oura's R. And if it's red, that means that Oura had a higher agreement with the subjective measurements. And if it's blue, it means Whoop had a higher agreement. And as you can see, the sleep scores of Oura had a better agreement with the sleep quality and feeling refreshed, whereas the readiness and recovery scores of Oura had a better agreement with the worst fatigue and the average fatigue. Now Whoop had a better alertness agreement with both the readiness and recovery score and the sleep scores. And actually the readiness and recovery score of Whoop also showed a better agreement with feeling rested or refreshed. But these are just the differences between devices and not how they individually performed. Now, if you're looking at these numbers and the results before and you're thinking, well, the differences between Oura and Whoop aren't actually that big, I think that's very reasonable as a conclusion, and it's also something I can generally agree with. In that case, if you're deciding between these two devices, your decision should probably come down to comfort, ring versus wrist strap, or maybe biceps where I wear it, battery life, which is better on the Whoop strap at the moment, charging habits, subscription costs, app experience, which is a bit more gamified on Whoop, and a bit more of a good overview on Oura. So again, what are you looking for? And there's a bunch more features. And again, there's also a lot of limitations to this testing right here. First, we only are looking at 4 participants, so they're giving a first indication, but definitely not a definite estimate for everyone. Second, these self-reports are noisy. Even with instructions not to check the scores before answering. I don't know if that happened. For some days, maybe for some people, some data was checked for one wearable, not the other. Or maybe if they felt worse, they checked and they didn't check when they felt good. I don't know exactly what happened. And third, correlation is not accuracy in a way. It's just a metric I selected to look at the data. A higher correlation in this case means that the device associates with how people feel to some degree, but it's far from perfect. And fourth, these scores that Oura and Whoop use are proprietary. We don't know how they calculate them, and they could change at any time. So please just use these results as a useful hint for typical behavior in a small sample and not a final test. Now, my conclusion as a scientist is that sleep and readiness scores can be useful if you treat them as sort of trend indicators. The best way to use them, I think, is not to ask, is the day objectively 81 as my Oura tells me? But maybe you should ask, is this higher or lower than my usual? and does it match with what I'm experiencing, and do I believe that it can add something to my own estimation? Because as we saw in this data set, the day-to-day direction does often match the subjective experience, but not always. So there will be mismatches and also wrong measurements by these devices. And of course, also human physiology and perception are very complicated. And these devices and scores are also not perfect. So there's so many sources of noise. But it's still interesting. Imperfect data can still be useful. And I also really have to give a huge thank you to the 4 subscribers who contributed data and tracked this consistently for more than a month. This kind of effort is super important and rare, and it's the only reason I can do these kinds of analysis on bigger groups of people in a non-marketing way. I actually want to do bigger follow-ups with more participants on also different brands like Garmin, Apple, Fitbit, Polar, soon to Coros. If you have those and you want to volunteer and you actually want to track this for a month, let me know on my website link below. There's a contact form there. Please put in the subject line something like your wearable brand and then subjective versus objective, so I know that you're interested. It does take some effort. I would share a Google Sheet with you that you have to fill out every day for a month, so only do it if you really want to do it. Now, if you do end up getting a Whoop strap, or maybe you want to get yourself an Oura ring, you want to support the channel and also support your own wallet, use one of my affiliate links in the description below. Or if you decide to get something else like a Polar Loop, an H-Sleep Pod, my favorite sleep improvement device, or anything at all on Amazon for that matter, even something as small as toilet paper or coffee beans, there's also a general Amazon affiliate link in the description below. Now, you can also become a YouTube member, which is like Patreon on YouTube, and it gives you early access to some of my videos. And given that you watched this video, I think you will like this video on the Whoop strap or this video on the Oura ring.